If you don't know that what we call the global economy is actually a giant pyramid that was forced to grow because of the decision made by one country and one man in 1971, then you don't understand how the world you live in really works, or why you keep losing. With the decision made on that day, you must know that the value of money would no longer come from gold, but from what is stolen from your life, and the debt that will be loaded onto future generations. Learning how that pyramid was built and why it constantly needs a larger base may hurt you. Although that decision appeared to be an improvement made by governments, what they actually did was fundamentally change the nature of money in ways they themselves could not foresee at the time. Money would no longer be created through produced value. It would be created through debt. To put it more simply, whenever the state needed money, the Treasury would issue a new bond. The central bank, owned by the state, would buy that bond, and in return it would create money from nothing. In other words, without production or labor, new money could simply be created out of thin air. But one of the absolute laws of physics reminds us of this. What exists cannot be completely destroyed, and what does not exist cannot be created from nothing. So what did this mean? It meant that new money would also mean new debt. Money was no longer an existing value. It had become debt itself, and in return it would be created by stealing from future human beings. Creating money through debt meant that future generations would pay for it. Within the gears of time, this pushed the economy into an invisible, functioning giant pyramid, because the money created with debt had to be paid back later, with interest. In other words, non-existent money was being created and would later have to be repaid. Here's the contradiction. How do you pay back money that doesn't exist? The answer, of course, was through new debt. This created a never-ending, vicious cycle. And this cycle forced the system to grow. If the cycle stopped growing, the new money needed to repay old debt could not be created, and the system would collapse under its own weight, because debt cannot be repaid with money that does not exist. This was exactly a pyramid logic. For the system to function and for those at the top of the pyramid to survive, new resources had to constantly flow in from below. After this decision, the United States didn't just change itself, it rapidly changed the entire global balance. America began running continuous budget deficits because it no longer had to obey gold reserves to access the money it needed. As American spending increased, other countries began to doubt the value of the dollar, because a country that constantly ran deficits became less trustworthy. So they began converting their dollar reserves, which were starting to lose value, into gold, and demanded physical gold from the US as payment for their debts, not dollars. This demand grew so massively that America rapidly burned through its gold reserves to meet it. Nixon's action at the time was actually a forced move taken to protect the remaining gold. But with this step, he unintentionally pushed the world into an irreversible system, the fiat money system. Fiat money is not valued by gold. Its value comes from belief. If people believe that the paper, the dollar, is valuable, the system functions smoothly. But the moment they stop believing, it begins to collapse. This is why governments and central banks must constantly create new stories of economic growth to keep the public's faith in money alive and to make them believe in it. But the real source of that apparent growth was very often not real production or manufacturing. It was the creation of new debt. Because the pyramid system could stay alive only this way. The first negative effect of this system was inflation. As the money supply increased, the purchasing power of the money that already existed began to fall. When something becomes abundant, it loses value. What is scarce is valuable. What is abundant becomes less valuable or worthless. For example, the chocolate bar that once cost 25 cents and gasoline that cost 31 cents soon appeared as 50 cents for chocolate and 50 cents for gasoline. Because as money increased, you needed more paper to buy the same goods. People thought this was normal, but it wasn't normal at all, because as we said, this was a hidden tax taken from society to keep the pyramid standing. The cost of keeping the system alive was rising prices, in other words, inflation. This process didn't just remain a simple rise in prices. It reshaped people's lives and made everything harder. Families that once lived on a single income could no longer survive on one paycheck. After the 1970s, they needed a second income. Women entered the workforce out of necessity just to meet basic needs. Savings rates fell. People became unable to save. After a decade passed, even with multiple people working in a household, they realized their combined income still couldn't cover their needs. So they turned to credit. To buy a house or a car, people began relying on mortgages, credit cards, consumer loans. All of these became necessary just to maintain a living standard that one paycheck easily covered in the past, before inflation wiped out its value. A system was created that made people accept living in helplessness as something natural, all because of the decision made that day. The new system created after 1971 didn't just affect America. Other countries began entering their own currency wars. Because once money was no longer tied to gold, governments started deliberately devaluing their own currencies. A weaker currency meant cheaper goods. Cheaper goods meant an advantage in global markets. This is why, contrary to popular belief, many countries intentionally devalued their money. This process caused manufacturing centers to shift from wealthy nations with strong currencies to poorer countries with cheap labor. Cities in developed nations emptied out, factories shut down, massive industrial hubs turned into ghost towns. Because compared to other countries, production in those wealthy nations was too expensive, and expensive products could not compete globally. In the places where production died, what kept things running was the debt system. And since that day, the global economic pyramid has become an invisible structure that will collapse if it stops growing, and must grow through more debt in order not to collapse. Today we know money is created from debt, but the decision that shaped this structure may have been made in 1971, yet its foundations were laid 27 years earlier. In 1944, before World War II ended, the Bretton Woods Conference designed the blueprint of the modern financial system. The system worked smoothly in its early years because, compared to the exhausted and nearly bankrupt European nations, America held the world's largest gold reserves. The dollar was truly like gold because it had a real physical backing. But by the 1960s, the picture changed fast. The U.S. was financing the Vietnam War, running massive social programs, and on top of that, taking on enormous projects like the moon mission to compete with Russia in the space race. The U.S. Treasury began spending money faster than the gold it physically held. The consequences of these huge expenses did not escape the world's attention. Countries, especially France, began intentionally converting their dollars into gold, like taking advantage of a weak hand at a roulette table. Because they foresaw the dollar losing value, they demanded physical gold from the U.S. They doubted whether America truly had as much gold as the dollar circulating in the world. As this demand grew among other countries too, America's gold reserves shrank visibly and dramatically. The dollar was still telling the world, "I am backed by gold." But this was no longer fully true. This was the real beginning of the crisis. Nixon's 1971 move was forced. He had no other option. But it triggered a chain of events that people of that era never imagined would turn out the way they did. When the dollar's gold backing was removed, every currency in the world suddenly fell into a void, and to fill that void, the system we still use today was born. Money was no longer a measure of value. It became a tool shaped entirely by the political decisions and self-interest of those who govern nations. To understand that the modern economy works like a pyramid, and what kinds of problems this creates, you only need to see one truth. In this system, to pay off existing debt, and even bigger debt must always be created. If the lower layer of the pyramid does not expand, If new participants are not pulled into the system, the upper layers collapse on their own. With the decisions made back then, governments, corporations, and households all became trapped inside the same pyramid. The thing that created this distorted structure is simple. Money no longer comes from production, manufacturing, or capability. It comes from debt stolen from the future. The summary of this mechanism is this. When a government borrows to cover its costs and expenses, new money is created. When a bank gives out a loan, new money is created. When a company issues a bond, new money is created. The system turned into a giant tower that only stays standing as long as someone, and that someone is always the public, keeps borrowing. This is why no country can stop borrowing. Because the moment it stops, if it's not producing enough, the bottom layer of the pyramid begins to shrink. And at this exact point, the system's most hidden rule comes into effect. To pay off an old debt, you must take on or create a new and bigger debt. This method makes it mathematically impossible for debt to ever disappear. A system trying to pay debt with more debt. Think about it. If the only money you have was created through borrowing, then to repay that debt you need to borrow again. When you examine this pyramid, you can see clearly who stands on which layer, who gains and who pays the price. This rule puts governments, corporations, and individuals on the same line. When a government's old bond reaches maturity, meaning it needs to be repaid, suddenly a new bond appears. The government uses the money from the new bond to pay the old one, resetting the timer, but not the debt. The same way governments do this. A company takes on bigger debt to roll over its previous debt. Banks do this every day. And ordinary people do the same, taking out a loan to pay off their credit card. They are all players of the same cycle. Close the old one, open the new one, take a bigger one. And here is where the second layer of the pyramid appears. If you understood the logic, then you should also understand this. The system must grow. If it stops, it collapses. This is why every year, citizens, banks, countries, and global debt as a whole must be larger than the previous year. It's built into the nature of the system. Even if the economy doesn't grow, the debt grows, because old debts cannot truly be repaid. They appear to be repaid, but what is actually created is new and larger debt. Universal mathematical laws show us the truth. The world economy survives not by sustaining itself, but by dumping its burden onto the generations that come after it. On paper, this cycle looks perfect. It looks like economic growth. Because everyone, from the leaders of the country to the lowest income citizens, sees a growth number. But there is no real growth. Production isn't increasing. Value isn't being created. It's all just a balloon inflated with debt. No one has the courage to say the king is naked. This economic pyramid system is not breathing. The system is pumping air into itself. And the inflation of this balloon isn't only at the top with governments. Households form the lowest and widest layer of the pyramid. If people don't borrow, consumption drops. If consumption drops, company revenues fall. If revenues fall, taxes fall. If taxes fall, the government borrows. When the government borrows, money increases. When money increases, consumption is once again supported by new debt. A closed loop. And whether we like it or not, everyone is a forced participant in this system. Here lies the real danger. When the ordinary people who form the base of the pyramid slow down their borrowing, the entire chain in the system doesn't break, but it loosens. The finance world panics because there is no real value in the system, only circulating debt. If the flow of debt slows, the layers of the pyramid cannot carry the weight. What we saw in the global crisis of 2008 was exactly this. What actually happened was a kind of rehearsal for the inevitable end. The consumer stumbled by, failing to repay the debt they took on, and when money stopped flowing, the flow of credit stopped, and one layer of the pyramid collapsed. Just when it was about to pull down the entire pyramid with it, the state stepped in and kept it alive through artificial respiration via the central banks. And this brings us to the second major rule that keeps the pyramid functioning. When the system begins to stumble and approaches collapse, intervention comes from the top, because in order to prevent those at the top from losing their gains, everyone must be pulled back into the gears again. This is done as follows. Central banks print money, governments borrow again under the guise of restoring stability and prosperity, and they hold the pyramid upright. But this does not strengthen the pyramid. It only postpones the pain of collapse to a later date. To prevent that trembling from being felt, new participants are constantly added to the system. New consumer, new credit, new debt, new money. What societies are told is never salvation or a new system. The underlying truth is painful. The economy is not shown as growing through real growth. It is shown as growing through borrowing. What truly grows is the scale of debt itself. Because real growth stands not on production, but on value stolen from the future. Not on savings, but on burdens left to the next generation. This is the second layer of the pyramid, a distorted structure that must be spun, must keep growing, and enters crisis when it slows or collapses the moment it stops, forced to survive by covering old debt with new debt. Who sits at the top of the pyramid? This pyramid does not grow solely because the people at the bottom borrow, nor because of the banks in the middle layer. Above them sits the hidden section, the small group whose decisions control everything. This group consists of the central banks inside governments who have the power to create money, and the giant financial institutions. In other words, at the very top of the pyramid sit not the value creators, but the money controllers. This exposes the third fundamental rule of the pyramid. Those at the top never lose. Even when they are supposed to lose, they still win, and the cost is pushed downward, paid by the people. If a private company or a public institution makes a bad decision and collapses, it is a natural result. But if a bank collapses, here is where the top of the pyramid moves immediately. Why? Because being close to the peak, being critical to the system, they are never abandoned, never allowed to fail. Even if they wanted to collapse, they would not be allowed, because the collapse of that bank would create a domino effect down the pyramid. To prevent that chain from breaking, the intervention begins immediately. Under the promise of saving the public, new money is printed, new debt is created, and the system is spun for a little longer. But what is saved is not the public, it is the system itself. This is exactly why those at the top turn economic crises into opportunities and benefit from them. The weaker the system becomes, the stronger they grow. Why? Because the pyramid is built this way. The summit draws strength from the loss of the base. The base must work and borrow so the top can earn, and the more the base borrows, the more the top gains. In this layer, another truth is hidden. The system must grow. Because whenever the base stops borrowing, the summit cannot carry its own weight. This is why those at the top constantly create growth stories and make the masses believe them. Throughout history, the names have changed. Technological breakthrough, internet age, home ownership dream, and today, the age of artificial intelligence. Each has a different name and a different coat, but all serve the same purpose: to add a new layer to the pyramid, to create new borrowers, new believers, and to inflate the system with a new wave of hope. And here is what must be noticed. At the very top of the system, there is actually nothing. No real production, no real value, only promises. This is why one of the most striking aspects of the modern economic pyramid is that it is built not on real production, but on the sale of hope. This exposes the great truth of the pyramid. Those at the top do not need to know the future or shape it. They only need to create new masses who will believe in new hopes and new promises. And therefore the system becomes a structure fed with hope and hollow stories. For the comfort of the top layer to continue, the debt of those at the bottom must continue, and the entire system stands on this thin illusion. Nothing fed by this pyramid can grow forever. No matter how big the global economy looks, no matter how much money is created, no matter how much debt is expanded, the day will come, and be sure it will come, when the people at the base can no longer carry the burden. Today, the world economy has dangerously approached that point. A balloon that inflates itself with a pump, a $300 trillion debt pyramid, now stands locked onto the same question. Can new debt be created fast enough to keep the system going? For now, the answer is still yes. But the D, and it is not far, when the answer turns into no. That is the moment the pyramid collapses. The collapse will not be like a sudden explosion. The moment the answer becomes no, it begins quietly. And the first sign is this: confidence disappears. People begin to lose faith in this system works, just like in ancient Rome. The flow of money to the top of the pyramid slows. Consumers spend less, borrow less, or stop borrowing altogether. Investors take fewer risks, and companies cannot grow because they cannot find enough believers for their growth stories. But the real and most powerful break happens when states can no longer roll over their debt and cannot pay it back. Just like ancient Florence, just like today's Argentina, just like Venezuela. If a government cannot find enough buyers in a bond auction, and here too there were no buyers, one of the load-bearing columns of the pyramid shifts out of place. This creates a domino effect that spreads to the middle class and all the way down to the bottom layer. This single event alone has turned into a crisis many times throughout financial history. Because if the government cannot borrow, every layer falls into a void, but the heaviest burden is always paid by the bottom. And when that moment arrives, what needs to be done is obvious, and governments act the same way. But all they do is delay the inevitable end. The central bank steps in. It prints money in an environment where confidence is lost and the money has no backing. It prints even more, but that money is already worthless. This only grows the debt. It inflates the system, but it does not stop the collapse, it only postpones it. So what signs should we look for to understand that we, the people crushed underneath, are approaching the final stage before the pyramid collapses? It is enough to look at interest rates and inflation. Even these two alone tell you something is very wrong. Today, both high debt and high inflation are occurring at the same time. This is the most dangerous, most deadly combination a pyramid system can ever face, because inflation weakens the bottom, the people, while interest rates break the middle layers. When these two forces enter the system at the same time, collapse is no longer a mathematical possibility. It becomes an unavoidable mechanical outcome. So how does the collapse happen? First scenario: inflation spirals out of control. Money rapidly loses value, purchasing power collapses, and people's salaries are no longer enough to cover even basic needs. In this scenario, the collapse is silent but devastating. Second scenario: a debt crisis explodes. A country can no longer roll over its debt. This scenario arrives with a chain of defaults. Third scenario: a global confidence break. At some point, a major player, a country, a bank, a fund, says, "I'm leaving the game," or "I'm about to," or "I already have." And today, these kinds of statements are already being whispered openly by serious players, and it is now something everyone hears and knows can happen. When this happens, the top of the pyramid is left hanging in midair, because that player, that game maker, no longer feels safe and pulls out to protect itself or to trigger a crisis to profit more. Everyone who hears this panics. Money flees to safe havens. Markets freeze. Fourth scenario: a combination of all scenarios. This is the most destructive outcome in history. When this one becomes real, states collapse, empires crumble, and they have collapsed before. The system suffocates under inflation, debt, and confidence loss all at the same time. The pyramid cannot endure and collapses. But the most important question is this: who gets crushed in the collapse? The answer is painful but simple: always the bottom layer. Meaning, salary-dependent workers, people paying rent, people using credit cards, those who made debt a lifestyle, those who can't protect their savings and lose them to inflation, those whose purchasing power evaporates. So, is there any way to stop the collapse? You cannot stop the system. You cannot stop the pyramid. You cannot change the nature of the pyramid. Because this system is built on debt, the real solution is not to save the system. The real solution is not to be buried underneath it. A pyramid collapsing is not the end of life, but being unprepared when it collapses can be the end of your life. Today, the world is standing on exactly such a threshold. The pyramid's load-bearing columns are trembling as if hit by an earthquake. The base, the workers, the public, is exhausted and worn out because their income is no longer enough. The middle layer is already fragile, and the top layer is aware of its own greed and wants even more. Only one real question remains. You've seen how this system works, at least as much as we can show. When this collapse comes, where do you want to be? If you liked it or found it helpful, you can subscribe, like, or share. The choice is yours. See you in the next video.